The morning of August 14th, 1944, Jean-Baptiste Moreau guided his plough horse through the southwestern corner of his wheat field outside Éperlecques, in the Pas-de-Calais region of northern France. The August sun had barely cleared the horizon, and the pre-dawn chill still clung to the furrows. Moreau was 63 years old, a third-generation farmer working land his grandfather had cleared in the 1870s. For 4 years, German occupation forces had requisitioned most of his harvest, leaving him enough grain to survive but little more. Now, with Allied forces pressing eastward from Normandy, the German soldiers who'd been living in his barn had disappeared 3 days earlier, taking his best horses and leaving chaos in their wake. The plough blade caught on something solid. Not a rock. Moreau knew his fields too well for that. He stopped the horse, knelt in the fresh dirt, and began digging with his hands. His fingers struck concrete, smooth and manufactured, perhaps 30 centimeters below the surface. He cleared more soil away, revealing a rectangular slab roughly 2 meters across. Near one edge, he found a metal ring flush with the concrete, a hatch. And where there was one hatch, Moreau's wartime instincts told him, there were probably more. By noon, Moreau had located 4 more concrete slabs scattered across his southwestern field. They formed no obvious pattern, but all bore the same characteristics. Flat concrete surfaces buried under just enough soil to hide them from aerial observation, each with a recessed metal ring for lifting. That afternoon, Canadian reconnaissance scouts from the 3rd Infantry Division arrived at his farmhouse, part of the Allied advance sweeping through the Pas-de-Calais. Moreau led them to his wheat field and showed them what he'd found. Within hours, combat engineers had lifted one of the hatches and discovered a ladder descending into darkness. The ladder led to a concrete tunnel. The tunnel connected to 5 additional chambers, and those chambers contained equipment the Germans had abandoned in their hasty retreat: radio apparatus, mapping tables, ammunition stores, and ventilation systems that suggested an extensive underground network the Allies had never suspected existed in this particular location. What Jean-Baptiste Moreau had stumbled upon that August morning represented a fragment of history's most extensive coastal fortification system, a defensive network that stretched from Norway to the Spanish border and consumed more concrete than any military construction project in modern warfare. But the story of how these bunkers came to be buried beneath a French farmer's field, and why their discovery mattered to Allied intelligence officers, begins not with Moreau's plough blade striking concrete, but with a strategic vision conceived 3 years earlier, when Hitler's armies controlled the entire Atlantic coastline, and the Third Reich believed its European empire would last 1,000 years. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. March 1942. Führer Directive No. 40 designated the Atlantic Wall, Hitler's comprehensive coastal defense system, designed to make Nazi-occupied Europe impregnable against Allied invasion. The directive called for 15,000 individual fortifications to be constructed within 3 years, stretching nearly 3,000 miles from the northern tip of Norway to the Franco-Spanish border at the Pyrenees. The sheer scale of the project defied conventional military engineering. Traditional fortress construction had always prioritized depth over breadth, concentrating maximum firepower in strategically vital locations. Hitler's vision inverted this logic. He demanded a continuous barrier, an unbroken line of concrete strong points that would defend every beach, every harbour, every potential landing site along the entire Atlantic perimeter. The Führer's reasoning was straightforward. The Allies possessed overwhelming naval superiority and could strike anywhere. If Germany defended only the obvious targets like Calais or Cherbourg, the British and Americans would simply land wherever defences were weakest. Therefore, Germany had to defend everywhere simultaneously. The man tasked with transforming Hitler's vision into reality was Fritz Todt, the engineer who had built Germany's Autobahn network during the 1930s. Todt created Organisation Todt, a paramilitary construction group that would eventually employ over 1.4 million workers across occupied Europe. The workers came from everywhere: German engineers and construction specialists, skilled labourers conscripted from conquered territories under the compulsory service du travail obligatoire, and tens of thousands of Soviet, Polish, French, and other prisoners of war who worked as slave labour under brutal conditions. They built around the clock, 7 days per week, working in shifts illuminated by massive floodlights when darkness fell. The standardization of Atlantic Wall construction represented revolutionary military engineering. Traditional fortress design had always been bespoke, with each fortification custom-built to fit its specific terrain and tactical purpose. Organisation Todt developed a catalogue of standardized designs called Regelbauten, or regulation buildings. Each design received an R designation number, R612 bunkers for personnel shelters, R667 bunkers for artillery observation posts, R677 bunkers for anti-tank guns, and dozens of other standardized types. This standardization allowed rapid construction. Once Organisation Todt established the manufacturing infrastructure to produce prefabricated steel reinforcement frameworks and formwork, crews could replicate identical bunkers across thousands of miles of coastline. The designs included provisions for camouflage from the beginning. Engineers built bunkers to blend into their surroundings, disguising them as farm buildings, beach houses, or natural hillside features. Some positions were deliberately buried under soil and vegetation, invisible from the air, revealed only by small observation slits or ventilation pipes that could be mistaken for farming equipment from a distance. The Pas-de-Calais region, where Jean-Baptiste Moreau farmed his wheat fields, received the heaviest concentration of Atlantic Wall fortifications. German strategists recognized Calais as the most likely invasion point. The channel narrowed to just 21 miles between Dover and Calais, offering Allied forces the shortest sea crossing, the quickest supply lines, and the most direct route toward the industrial heart of the Ruhr Valley. If rational military planning dictated the invasion site, logic pointed to Calais. Consequently, the region received more bunkers, more artillery, more garrison troops, and more resources than any comparable stretch of coastline. Between Calais and Boulogne-sur-Mer, Organisation Todt constructed over 800 major fortifications, in addition to countless smaller positions. These included massive coastal artillery batteries like Battery Todt, equipped with 4 guns salvaged from the French battleship Provence, each capable of hurling 150mm shells across the English Channel. Other sites housed rocket launching facilities, radar installations, ammunition depots, troop barracks, and command centres, all connected by an intricate network of underground tunnels and communications cables. Construction reached its peak during 1943. Organisation Todt poured 17 million cubic metres of concrete along the French coastline alone, consumed 1.2 million tons of steel reinforcement, and spent 3.7 billion Reichsmarks. For perspective, 17 million cubic metres of concrete would build a wall 3 metres high and 1 metre thick, stretching from Paris to Moscow. The scale of resources diverted to Atlantic Wall construction represented a massive strategic commitment. Every ton of steel reinforcing bunkers in France was a ton unavailable for tank production. Every skilled engineer mixing concrete in Normandy was an engineer not building fortifications on the Eastern Front, where Soviet armies were grinding westward through German defences. Every forced labourer digging bunker foundations in Calais was a worker not producing munitions in German factories. But Hitler insisted. The Führer believed absolutely that the decisive battle of the war would occur when Allied forces attempted their inevitable invasion of Western Europe. If Germany could throw the Allies back into the sea during that first crucial 24 hours, if German defenders could hold their beach positions long enough for panzer divisions to reach the coast and annihilate the invaders, then the entire Allied strategy would collapse. Britain would lose stomach for further offensive operations. America would reconsider its Europe First strategy. Perhaps, Hitler reasoned, his Western enemies would even agree to negotiate a separate peace, allowing Germany to concentrate all its power against the Soviet Union in the East. The Atlantic Wall was therefore not just a defensive barrier, it was the foundation for Nazi Germany's hope of ultimate victory. The invasion had to be stopped at the beaches. Everything depended on those concrete bunkers holding their positions during those first critical hours, while German reinforcements rushed to the threatened sector. The German garrison troops manning Atlantic Wall positions during late 1943 and early 1944 were a mixed collection of forces. Some divisions were first-rate, staffed by experienced soldiers equipped with modern weapons. Others were decidedly second-tier formations, composed of older men, recovered, wounded, or troops deemed unfit for combat on the Eastern Front. The 716th Infantry Division defending the Normandy coast, for example, included significant numbers of Ost battalions, ethnic Russians and other Soviet nationals who had defected or been captured and chose to serve Germany rather than face starvation in prisoner camps. Many spoke limited German and had questionable loyalty. The 709th Infantry Division, stationed around Cherbourg, averaged 40 years old, well above the typical age for frontline soldiers. Its ranks included men with stomach ailments who required special diets, men with hearing loss from previous combat, and men recovering from wounds that had left them capable of garrison duty but unsuitable for mobile warfare. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel arrived in November 1943 to inspect Atlantic Wall defences and immediately recognized the strategic problem. The fortifications were impressive, certainly, but they were not continuous. Massive bunker complexes existed at obvious invasion sites, Calais, Le Havre, Cherbourg. Between these strongpoints, however, long stretches of coastline received minimal fortification. An attacker willing to land on open beaches away from major ports could bypass the strongest defences entirely. Rommel demanded additional obstacles. He ordered millions of mines planted on beaches and in coastal fields. He required soldiers to install elaborate barriers in shallow water, massive wooden or steel structures designed to rip apart landing craft at high tide. He demanded thousands of Rommel asparagus, tall wooden poles planted in potential glider landing zones to make airborne operations suicidal. The work consumed February, March, April, and May of 1944. German soldiers in Normandy, Brittany, and the Pas-de-Calais worked frantically to strengthen defences, knowing the invasion would come soon but uncertain of where. And hidden among all these obvious defensive preparations, buried beneath fields and hills across northern France, lay hundreds of smaller, less conspicuous bunkers that served not as fighting positions but as communications centres, storage depots, and observation posts for the larger defensive network. These secondary positions often received less attention from Allied intelligence. Aerial reconnaissance focused on obvious targets, large gun emplacements, radar installations, troop concentrations. Smaller bunkers, deliberately camouflaged and buried under soil, could escape notice entirely. Their existence was known in general terms. German defenders surely had communications bunkers and supply depots, but their exact locations, their specific purposes, and the extent of the underground networks connecting them often remained uncertain until Allied forces actually occupied the territory. This is where Jean-Baptiste Moreau's accidental discovery in his wheat field becomes significant. June 6, 1944. The Allied invasion struck not at Calais, where German defenders expected it, but 150 miles southwest at Normandy. The strategic surprise was complete. Hitler and his high command, deceived by elaborate Allied intelligence operations that convinced them Normandy was merely a diversion, held back critical panzer divisions around Calais for days after the landings, waiting for the real invasion that would never come. The Normandy beachheads held, reinforcements poured ashore. Within a week, Allied forces had established a lodgment in France that could not be dislodged. By early August, American forces under General George Patton had broken out from the Normandy perimeter and were racing eastward across France. British and Canadian forces advanced northward toward the Pas-de-Calais, finally attacking the region where Germany had concentrated its heaviest fortifications. The Germans defended stubbornly. Atlantic Wall bunkers near major ports like Le Havre, Boulogne, and Calais held out for weeks after the surrounding territory had been liberated. These were the fortress positions, heavily armed, deeply supplied, garrisoned by troops who understood they had nowhere to retreat. But between these major strongpoints, smaller German units faced an impossible situation. The strategic picture had collapsed. The Western Front was disintegrating. Retreat eastward toward Germany offered the only hope of survival. Many garrisons simply abandoned their positions during early September, leaving behind equipment they couldn't carry and destroying what they could. The Canadian 3rd Infantry Division, advancing through the Pas-de-Calais during early September 1944, encountered abandoned bunker after abandoned bunker. Some positions showed signs of hasty demolition. Engineers had triggered explosives to collapse tunnel entrances or destroy sensitive equipment. Others were simply empty, doors standing open, papers scattered across floors. Ammunition still stacked in magazines. The Germans had departed so quickly they hadn't time for thorough destruction. This is the context in which Jean-Baptiste Moreau discovered those concrete slabs in his wheat field on August 14th. The German troops billeted on his farm had withdrawn eastward days earlier as Allied forces approached. They'd taken Moreau's horses and any food supplies they could carry. They'd burned some papers behind his barn. But they'd left without thoroughly demolishing the buried facilities near his property, perhaps because they lacked time, perhaps because they lacked the explosives necessary for complete destruction, or perhaps because they simply didn't consider the positions strategically important enough to justify the effort. Moreau's accidental discovery with his plow revealed an underground communication post that German forces had used to coordinate defensive operations across a 10-kilometer sector of the Pas-de-Calais. The facility included radio equipment, landline telephone connections to forward observation posts, encrypted communication devices, and detailed maps showing defensive positions throughout the region. The maps particularly interested Allied intelligence officers because they revealed the locations of minor defensive works that aerial reconnaissance had missed. Over the following days, Canadian combat engineers explored the full extent of the underground network. What had appeared to be 5 separate concrete slabs turned out to be entrance hatches to an interconnected system of tunnels and chambers extending nearly 200 meters beneath Moreau's property. The facility included 12 distinct chambers, each serving a specific function. 3 chambers housed radio equipment and operators' stations. 2 chambers contained fuel generators for electrical power. 1 chamber served as the command post with communications equipment and map displays. 2 chambers stored ammunition and spare parts. 1 chamber functioned as a small infirmary. 2 chambers served as sleeping quarters for the permanent garrison of perhaps 30 men. The final chamber contained a water cistern and ventilation equipment. The construction impressed the Allied engineers who explored it. Concrete walls, 2 meters thick, steel reinforced, would withstand anything short of a direct hit from heavy artillery. Ventilation systems with multiple intakes scattered across the surface ensured fresh air circulation even if some intakes were damaged. Multiple exit hatches provided escape routes if the main entrance collapsed. The Germans had designed these facilities to survive intensive bombardment and continue functioning as nerve centers coordinating defensive operations even after the surface positions were destroyed. But all the sophisticated engineering couldn't overcome the fundamental strategic reality. By mid-August 1944, the Atlantic Wall had failed. The invasion had succeeded. Allied forces were advancing, and no amount of concrete and steel could reverse Germany's deteriorating strategic position. The discovery of the bunker complex beneath Moreau's field represented one small incident in a much larger pattern. Throughout September and October 1944, as Allied forces liberated northern France, civilians repeatedly revealed hidden German positions to their liberators. Sometimes the discoveries were accidental, a farmer ploughing his field, a child exploring a wooded hillside, a civilian clearing rubble from a damaged building. Other times, French resistance members deliberately led Allied intelligence officers to positions they'd secretly observed during the occupation. Each discovery added details to Allied understanding of German defensive networks, revealing the sophistication and extent of fortification systems that had often gone unnoticed from the air. The intelligence value of these discoveries extended beyond the immediate tactical situation. Military engineers studied German bunker designs, documenting construction techniques, structural innovations, and defensive concepts that might inform future fortification projects. Specialists examined abandoned equipment, analyzed German communication systems, and evaluated the effectiveness of various defensive layouts. Historians and intelligence officers interviewed French civilians who'd observed German construction activities over the previous 4 years, gathering information about resource allocation, labor practices, and the timeline of Atlantic Wall development. All this information flowed back to rear area analysis centers, where it was compiled into comprehensive reports that circulated among Allied military planners. But perhaps most important was what these discoveries revealed about German strategic thinking in the war's final year. The Atlantic Wall, despite its impressive physical presence, had been built on a flawed premise that Germany could defend everywhere simultaneously with fixed fortifications. The reality of mobile modern warfare, with its emphasis on air power, mechanized forces, and fluid battle lines, had rendered static defensive lines obsolete. The Maginot Line had failed to stop Germany's westward attack in 1940. Now, Hitler's Atlantic Wall had failed to stop the Allies' eastward offensive. The pattern suggested a fundamental truth about 20th century warfare. Concrete bunkers, no matter how numerous or well constructed, could not substitute for adequate mobile reserves, air superiority, and the strategic initiative. Jean-Baptiste Moreau continued farming his land after the Canadian soldiers departed. The underground bunker complex beneath his southwest wheat field remained largely intact, too deeply buried and solidly built to remove economically. The concrete slabs, once carefully camouflaged, now stood exposed where Canadian engineers had lifted them for exploration. Moreau ploughed around them for the remainder of his farming career, permanent scars on his landscape, silent testimony to the 4 years when foreign soldiers had occupied his nation and built their fortress empire on French soil. The story of how one farmer's routine agricultural work accidentally revealed an extensive hidden fortification illustrates a larger historical irony. Germany had invested enormous resources constructing the Atlantic Wall, diverting materials, labor, and engineering expertise away from mobile weapons production to build thousands of static defensive positions. The fortifications failed to prevent the Allied invasion. After the invasion succeeded, advancing Allied forces discovered many of these carefully hidden positions, not through sophisticated intelligence operations, but through the ordinary activities of French civilians reclaiming their normal lives. Farmers ploughing fields struck concrete with their plough blades. Children exploring woods found ventilation pipes protruding from hillsides. Civilians clearing war damage discovered hatches hidden in rubble. The Atlantic Wall had been designed to be invisible from the air, camouflaged against aerial reconnaissance that might reveal defensive positions to Allied planners. But camouflage that fooled aerial photographs couldn't hide bunkers from people who lived on the land, who knew every field and forest, who noticed new concrete structures appearing during the occupation years and remembered their locations. The German defenders had spent 4 years trying to hide their fortifications from enemies in Britain and America. They'd succeeded in concealing many positions from distant aerial observation, but they couldn't hide from the French civilians who lived alongside their bunkers every day. And when those civilians were liberated, when Allied forces arrived and Frenchmen could finally speak freely without fear of reprisal, the hidden bunkers were revealed not by intelligence agencies, but by ordinary people pointing to the ground beneath their feet and saying, "There, the Germans built something there." This fundamental miscalculation, the belief that fortifications could remain effectively hidden in occupied territory, where hostile populations observed everything, represented another failure in the Atlantic Wall's strategic conception. The Germans had treated French civilians as if they were neutral terrain features, part of the landscape to be ignored or exploited as needed. They'd failed to recognize that occupying a nation creates millions of potential intelligence sources, people with powerful incentives to observe, remember, and eventually report defensive preparations when the opportunity arose. Every French farmer forced to watch German soldiers build bunkers on his land, Every French labourer conscripted to dig foundations and mix concrete, every French civilian whose daily routine brought him near Atlantic Wall construction sites, all of these people carried intelligence about German defences. They couldn't share that intelligence while France remained occupied. Doing so risked brutal reprisals, but they remembered, and when liberation came, memory transformed into intelligence assets more valuable than aerial photographs, because these civilians knew not just what they could see from above, but what lay hidden beneath the surface. The liberation of France during late summer and autumn 1944 revealed thousands of such hidden positions. Allied intelligence organizations established protocols for cataloguing information provided by French civilians. Military government detachments interviewed residents of newly liberated areas, asking standardized questions about German activities during the occupation. Where were bunkers located? How many soldiers garrisoned each position? What types of weapons and equipment had civilians observed? When had construction occurred? These interviews produced thousands of pages of reports, far more detailed information than aerial reconnaissance could have provided, documentation of defensive networks that Germans had believed successfully concealed. The irony deepened when analysts compared French civilian descriptions of German positions with captured German military documents. In many cases, the French civilians' information was more accurate. German military records often treated bunker locations in general terms, referring to position designations like Strongpoint 732, without providing precise geographic coordinates. French civilians, by contrast, described positions using local landmarks everyone in the area knew. The bunker beneath the oak tree near Widow Beaumont's cottage was more useful to Allied forces than observation post. Reference 456832 when the German grid reference system wasn't available. French civilian intelligence also revealed the human reality behind German defensive preparations in ways official documents never captured. Civilians described which German units had seemed professional and well-equipped versus which units appeared demoralized or poorly supplied. They reported on relationships between occupying forces and local populations, information that helped Allied psychological warfare specialists understand German troop morale. They described the evolution of German defensive thinking over 4 years, how priorities had shifted, where construction had accelerated or slowed, when certain positions had been reinforced or abandoned. This accumulation of small observations, individually insignificant but collectively revealing, provided Allied intelligence with an understanding of German Atlantic Wall defences far deeper than enemy commanders ever suspected their opponents possessed. And much of this intelligence flowed from incidents as mundane as Jean-Baptiste Moreau's plow blade striking concrete beneath his wheat field one August morning. The Canadian officers who explored the bunker complex under Moreau's farm documented what they found in typical military fashion: precise technical descriptions of dimensions, construction materials, and layout. Their report, filed with 3rd Infantry Division headquarters, noted the facility's communications equipment, mapped the tunnel system, and photographed the various chambers, before demolition teams began collapsing certain sections to prevent any possibility of German forces reoccupying the position. But the report also included a brief statement from Moreau himself, translated from his French testimony by a Canadian intelligence officer who spoke both languages. They came in 1942, Moreau told the Canadian captain. Perhaps 30 soldiers, with cement and steel and timber. They worked through the autumn and winter, digging, building, covering everything back over with soil. They took my wheat field for their construction. They paid nothing. When spring came and they'd finished, you couldn't see what they'd built unless you knew exactly where to look. They planted grass over the hatches. From my barn, I couldn't tell they'd disturbed the field at all. But I knew. I watched them build it. I remembered where every entrance was located. For 2 years, I ploughed around those spots, leaving narrow strips of unploughed land, telling them the soil there was too rocky. They never questioned it. Germans don't know farming. They didn't realize I was marking the locations, keeping track of what they'd hidden. I knew someday you'd come. I knew someday I'd show you where they built their bunkers. So I remembered. And today, when my plow finally struck one of their concrete slabs, I wasn't surprised. I was relieved, because now I could finally tell someone what I'd been forced to keep silent about for 2 years. Moreau's testimony captured the essence of why hidden German fortifications, despite all their sophisticated camouflage, ultimately failed to remain hidden. The French civilians hadn't been fooled. They'd been watching. They'd been remembering, and when liberation came, they'd been ready to reveal everything the occupiers had tried to conceal. This pattern repeated itself across France during the Liberation campaign, in Normandy, in Brittany, in the Pas-de-Calais, in every region where Germans had built Atlantic Wall fortifications. French civilians guided Allied soldiers to hidden positions. The intelligence windfall proved so valuable that military government detachments established formal procedures for collecting and cataloguing civilian-provided information about German defences. The Allied Expeditionary Force headquarters created standardized forms for recording bunker discoveries. Intelligence officers interviewed civilians in newly liberated villages, asking them to mark German positions on maps, to describe construction timelines, to estimate garrison sizes. The information gathered through these civilian interviews helped Allied forces in several ways. Tactically, knowing the locations of German positions allowed assault troops to approach from optimal angles and concentrate fire on vulnerable points. Operationally, understanding the extent and purpose of bunker networks helped commanders anticipate German defensive tactics. Strategically, analyzing Atlantic Wall construction revealed how Germany had allocated resources during the war's middle years, information useful for understanding enemy industrial capacity and strategic priorities. But perhaps the most important lesson concerned the fundamental relationship between military forces and civilian populations in occupied territories. German Atlantic Wall planners had treated French civilians as passive elements of the terrain, people who could be ignored as long as they were kept subdued through occupation policy. This was a catastrophic misunderstanding. The French civilians weren't passive. They were observing, recording, and waiting for the opportunity to share what they knew. Every bunker built in occupied France was built under the eyes of people who had every reason to want those bunkers revealed to Germany's enemies. September 1944. By month's end, virtually all of northern France had been liberated. The massive German fortifications around major ports continued to hold out. The garrison at Dunkirk wouldn't surrender until May 1945, the last weeks of the war. But most Atlantic Wall positions in France had been captured or abandoned. Allied engineers surveyed what remained, studying German construction techniques and defensive concepts. The scope and sophistication of the fortifications impressed Allied observers. The concrete quality was excellent, the structural engineering sound, the defensive layouts carefully considered. Under different strategic circumstances, properly manned and supported, these positions might have presented formidable obstacles. But the Atlantic Wall had suffered from 3 fatal flaws that no amount of concrete could overcome. First, the Germans had insufficient mobile reserves to counterattack against a major landing once it succeeded. All the bunkers in Normandy hadn't stopped the invasion because Germany lacked the panzer divisions necessary to throw the Allies back into the sea during those first crucial hours. The static defences could delay but couldn't defeat a determined attacker supported by overwhelming air and naval power. Second, the Atlantic Wall required more garrison troops than Germany could spare from other fronts. To properly man 15,000 fortified positions along 3,000 miles of coastline would have required millions of soldiers. Germany couldn't afford to tie down such massive forces in static defensive roles when the Eastern Front was consuming armies. Consequently, many Atlantic Wall positions were undermanned or garrisoned by second-tier troops of questionable effectiveness. Third, and perhaps most important, the Germans had failed to account for the intelligence value of hostile civilian populations living among their fortifications. French civilians had observed Atlantic Wall construction from its beginning. They'd noted every bunker location, every strong point, every defensive innovation. And when liberation came, they'd shared everything they knew with Allied forces, turning years of German construction work into intelligence assets for the attackers. Jean-Baptiste Moreau's accidental discovery of buried bunkers beneath his wheat field represented one small example of this pattern, repeated thousands of times across France as civilians revealed what the occupiers had tried to hide. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The post-war fate of Atlantic Wall fortifications illustrated the structure's ultimate irrelevance to military outcomes. Some major bunkers near cities were demolished as dangerous obstacles or repurposed as storage facilities. Many smaller positions were simply abandoned, too solidly built to remove economically, but too awkwardly located for civilian use. Farmers like Moreau learned to plow around concrete slabs that were too deeply buried to excavate. Coastal bunkers eroded slowly under salt air and waves, gradually disintegrating over decades. By the 1970s and 80s, historians and preservation groups began recognizing Atlantic Wall sites as historically significant structures worthy of documentation and protection. Some bunkers became museums, others were studied as examples of military architecture. A few were converted to private residences or commercial uses by entrepreneurs willing to work with the challenging structures, but most simply remained where they'd been built, scattered across the landscape, slowly being absorbed back into the terrain, as vegetation covered concrete and farmers filled in excavations with soil. The bunkers had been designed to last centuries. Instead, they'd become militarily obsolete within 2 years of completion. The story of Jean-Baptiste Moreau and his accidental discovery beneath a wheat field offers multiple lessons about the relationship between military planning, civilian populations, and the ultimate futility of static defensive thinking in modern warfare. The Germans had invested enormously in creating what they believed was an impregnable fortress line along the Atlantic coast. They'd employed sophisticated engineering, standardized construction techniques, and massive resource allocation to build thousands of hardened positions. They'd attempted to hide many of these positions through careful camouflage, believing that concealment would preserve their defensive value even if the broad existence of Atlantic Wall fortifications was known to the enemy. But all these efforts foundered on realities the German planners either didn't understand or chose to ignore. Static defenses can't substitute for mobile reserves and strategic initiative. Fortifications located in hostile territory can't remain hidden from people who live on the land every day. And concrete bunkers, regardless of how well constructed, become irrelevant when the broader strategic situation collapses. The moment when Moreau's plow struck that buried concrete slab, the moment when his decades of farming experience told him something artificial lay beneath his wheat field, that moment represented the failure of German hopes that their fortifications could remain secret weapons even in defeat. The French farmer hadn't needed sophisticated intelligence training to recognize what he'd found. He hadn't needed aerial reconnaissance or signal intercepts or captured documents. He'd simply needed to remember what he'd watched German soldiers build on his land 2 years earlier, information he'd carried silently, through the occupation, waiting for the day when he could safely share it. That day came when Canadian troops arrived in early September. Moreau led them to his southwest field, showed them where to dig, and watched as Allied engineers explored what the Germans had thought they'd hidden successfully. In that moment, years of German construction work and strategic planning transformed into intelligence for the enemy, another small increment in the accumulation of knowledge that helped Allied forces understand and overcome the Atlantic Wall's defenses. The broader historical significance of this pattern, repeated across France as civilians revealed thousands of hidden positions, lies in what it teaches about the relationship between military forces and occupied populations. Occupation creates intelligence liabilities that occupying powers often fail to recognize. Every civilian forced to watch construction of defensive positions becomes a potential source who will, given the opportunity, share what they've observed with the occupier's enemies. Attempting to build secret fortifications in territory inhabited by hostile or resentful populations is fundamentally futile because the secrets can't be maintained once political control shifts. The Germans discovered this truth the hard way. when liberation allowed French civilians to finally speak freely about what they'd been forced to witness silently for 4 years. The Atlantic Wall's camouflaged bunkers had been hidden from aerial reconnaissance. They'd been concealed from distant observers, but they'd never been hidden from the French farmers, merchants, labourers, and villagers who lived beside them every day. And when those civilians could finally share their knowledge, the carefully maintained secrecy evaporated instantly, replaced by detailed intelligence about defensive networks the Germans had believed successfully concealed. Jean-Baptiste Moreau returned to his normal farming routine within days of conflictors, showing Canadian soldiers the buried bunkers beneath his wheat field. The engineers explored the underground complex, documented what they found, collapsed certain sections to prevent reuse, and departed. Moreau resumed ploughing, now fully aware of exactly where the concrete slabs lay beneath his soil. He marked their locations on his personal farm records, ensuring future cultivation would account for these permanent obstacles. In later years, he occasionally told the story of that August morning when his plough revealed what the Germans had hidden. The story became local history, one of countless similar narratives from France's liberation. Most of these stories were never written down, never formally documented, simply faded as the people who lived them grew old and died. But collectively, these thousands of incidents of French civilians revealing German positions represented a significant factor in Allied success during the liberation campaign. The intelligence provided by civilians wasn't dramatic or decisive in the way that breaking German codes or intercepting radio communications was decisive. But it was useful, adding details and context that enhanced Allied understanding of enemy defences, and it illustrated a fundamental principle that remains relevant in modern warfare: populations matter. Military planners who treat civilian populations as irrelevant or easily controlled make strategic mistakes that can't be corrected through superior firepower or better engineering. The Germans made this mistake when they built their Atlantic Wall fortifications on French soil, without considering that French civilians would remember every bunker location and eventually share that knowledge with Germany's enemies. The Atlantic Wall's failure wasn't primarily an engineering failure. The concrete was sound, the defensive layouts reasonable, the construction execution competent. The failure was strategic and political. Germany lacked the mobile reserves to support static defenses. Germany lacked the manpower to adequately garrison thousands of positions, and Germany failed to recognize that building fortifications in hostile territory ensured those fortifications would be revealed once political control shifted. Jean-Baptiste Moreau's plough, striking concrete beneath a wheat field one August morning, exposed this failure in miniature. The carefully hidden bunker complex represented millions of Reichsmarks invested, thousands of labour hours consumed, sophisticated engineering applied. But all that investment became intelligence for the enemy the moment a French farmer could safely reveal what he'd been forced to keep secret. The German soldiers, who'd built that bunker complex in 1942, had believed their camouflage would preserve operational security indefinitely. They'd covered their concrete slabs with soil, planted grass, left the field looking undisturbed. They'd assumed their work was hidden. They hadn't accounted for the farmer who'd watched them build it, who'd remembered every detail, who'd waited 2 years for the opportunity to show Allied forces exactly where the Germans had buried their bunkers. That failure of imagination, multiplied across thousands of similar incidents throughout occupied France, helped ensure the Atlantic Wall's ultimate futility as a defensive barrier. The morning of August 14th, 1944, represented more than one farmer accidentally discovering buried concrete while ploughing his field. It represented the moment when years of German occupation planning, military engineering, and resource investment confronted the reality that occupied populations never forget what their occupiers forced them to witness. Moreau had watched German soldiers build bunkers on his land. He'd remembered where those bunkers were located. And when liberation came, he'd revealed everything, transforming German defensive preparations into Allied intelligence assets. This pattern, repeated across France as thousands of civilians shared similar knowledge, helped Allied forces understand and overcome the Atlantic Wall's defences far more quickly than German planners had ever believed possible. The concrete bunkers remained, solid and well-built, lasting decades after the war. But their defensive value had evaporated the moment French civilians could speak freely to Allied liberators about what they'd observed during 4 years of occupation. The intelligence relationship between French civilians and Allied forces during the Liberation Campaign had actually begun long before the first Allied soldier set foot on French soil. Throughout the occupation years, from 1940 through 1944, French resistance networks had been documenting German defensive preparations and transmitting that information to Britain through clandestine radio operators and courier networks. These resistance intelligence operations provided crucial early warnings about Atlantic Wall construction, though the sheer scale of the project made comprehensive documentation impossible while France remained under German control. The French resistance network, known as Alibi, operating in northern France, specialized in gathering intelligence about German fortifications. Resistance members included railway workers who observed German military transports, postal employees who noted increased communications traffic to construction sites, and ordinary civilians who simply kept their eyes open and remembered what they saw. The network's operatives took enormous risks. Being caught with sketches of German positions or notes about troop movements meant torture and execution. Yet hundreds of French men and women accepted these risks, driven by patriotism and hatred of the occupation. Their reports, transmitted to London via secret radio sets or carried across the Pyrenees by couriers, provided British intelligence with early awareness of Atlantic Wall construction patterns and priorities. One resistance operative, a civil engineer named Marcel Girard, who'd been conscripted to supervise French labourers working on Atlantic Wall construction, maintained secret records of every position he worked on between 1942 and 1944. His notebooks, hidden beneath floorboards in his Calais apartment, documented the locations, dimensions, and armament of over 300 bunkers across a 30-kilometre stretch of coastline. Girard couldn't transmit this information to Britain. The volume of data was too large for radio transmission and too risky to entrust to courier networks that might be compromised. Instead, he waited. When Canadian forces liberated Calais in September 1944, Girard walked into Canadian headquarters, carrying his notebooks, and offered to guide intelligence officers to every position he'd documented. The Canadians spent 2 weeks conducting tours with Girard, visiting bunkers he'd helped build, comparing his records against what they found, and gaining detailed understanding of German construction techniques and defensive philosophy. Girard's contribution represented systematic intelligence collection maintained under incredibly dangerous circumstances. Most French civilians couldn't or wouldn't take such elaborate risks, but virtually all civilians observed something useful, even if they didn't recognize its intelligence value at the time. A farmer who noticed increased traffic on a rural road probably didn't realize he'd observed supply convoys supporting nearby construction activity. A shopkeeper who sold extra food to German soldiers probably didn't recognize she was feeding garrison troops at a new strong point. A child who explored woods near his village probably didn't understand that the concrete structure he found was a camouflaged observation post. But all these small observations accumulated into knowledge, and when liberation came, when Allied intelligence officers began systematically interviewing French civilians, all these small pieces of information emerged and coalesced into comprehensive understanding of German defensive networks. The intelligence value of French civilian knowledge became so obvious during the Liberation Campaign that Allied military government established formal protocols for collection and analysis. Every town and village liberated by Allied forces received a visit from specialized intelligence teams whose primary mission was interviewing civilians about German activities during the occupation. The teams used standardized questionnaires designed to elicit useful information without requiring civilians to understand military terminology or strategic concepts. Questions focused on observable facts. Where did German soldiers live? Which buildings did they occupy? Where did trucks go? What did civilians hear or see being built? How many soldiers were typically present? When did garrison sizes increase or decrease? These questions, systematically asked across hundreds of communities, generated thousands of reports that, when analysed collectively, revealed patterns invisible from aerial reconnaissance alone. The intelligence teams discovered that French civilians had noticed details no aerial photograph could capture. Civilians knew which German units seemed well-equipped versus which seemed poorly supplied. They recognized which officers treated French residents with relative decency versus which were brutal. They observed morale indicators, whether German soldiers seemed confident or anxious, whether discipline appeared tight or lax. This human intelligence, gathered from people who'd lived alongside German forces for 4 years, provided context and nuance that technical intelligence sources couldn't match. One particularly valuable category of civilian-provided intelligence concerned German construction timelines and priorities. By interviewing civilians in multiple locations and comparing their observations, Allied analysts could reconstruct how German defensive preparations had evolved over time. Which areas received fortifications first? Where did construction intensify during which periods? What did changes in construction activity reveal about German strategic priorities and resource availability? Civilians remembered these details because construction projects disrupted normal community life, requisitioned labor, commandeered materials, restricted access to certain areas. All these impacts registered in civilian memory, creating a record of German activities far more detailed than captured documents alone could provide. The cumulative intelligence value of French civilian knowledge extended beyond tactical information about bunker locations. Civilians provided strategic intelligence about German logistics, industrial capacity, and resource allocation. They'd observed how many trucks arrived at construction sites, what types of materials were delivered, where those materials came from. They'd noticed when German construction efforts slowed or accelerated, information that reflected Germany's changing strategic situation as the war progressed. They'd watched German garrison forces change in composition over time, as experienced troops were transferred to other fronts and replaced by older men or foreign conscripts, observations that revealed Germany's growing manpower crisis. All this information, gathered from thousands of interviews with ordinary French civilians, enhanced Allied understanding of German capabilities and limitations in ways that complemented technical intelligence sources like aerial reconnaissance and signal intercepts. The liberation of France also revealed the extent to which French civilians had protected Allied airmen shot down over occupied territory. Between 1940 and 1944, hundreds of British, Canadian, and American aircrews were forced to bail out over France after their aircraft were damaged by German defences. Many of these airmen were rescued by French civilians who hid them from German search parties, provided false identity documents, and guided them toward escape routes through Spain or secret evacuation operations along the Atlantic coast. The French civilians who participated in these rescue networks, known collectively as the evasion lines, risked execution if discovered by German security forces. Yet the networks persisted throughout the occupation, helping over 3,000 Allied airmen escape, capture, and return to Britain to fly again. When Allied forces liberated France, many of these rescued airmen returned to thank the French families who'd sheltered them, bringing gifts, photographs, and lasting friendships that connected French civilians with Allied military personnel long after the war ended. The evasion lines represented another form of French civilian resistance that directly supported Allied military operations. Every rescued airman was a trained pilot or crew member who could return to combat operations instead of spending years in a German prisoner camp. The cumulative impact was significant. The several thousand airmen returned to Allied forces through French evasion. Networks represented countless additional bombing missions and reconnaissance flights that supported the invasion and liberation campaigns. The French civilians who maintained these networks did so knowing they were directly contributing to Germany's defeat, accepting personal risk to achieve strategic impact. Their sacrifices earned lasting gratitude from Allied nations and demonstrated the potential for occupied populations to resist through non-violent but militarily significant actions. The relationship between French civilians and Allied forces during the liberation campaign illustrated broader principles about the interaction between military forces and civilian populations in occupied territories. Occupation inherently creates situations where civilians accumulate knowledge about occupying forces' activities, dispositions, and vulnerabilities. That knowledge becomes an intelligence asset for the occupier's enemies once political control shifts. Military planners who fail to account for this dynamic make strategic mistakes that can undermine otherwise sound defensive preparations. The Germans made this mistake throughout occupied Europe, but especially in France, where a sophisticated and educated population with strong historical identity and patriotic motivation observed everything German forces did and remembered it all until liberation allowed them to share their knowledge. The Atlantic Wall's fortifications, despite their impressive engineering and massive resource investment, couldn't overcome this fundamental vulnerability. Every bunker built in France was observed by French civilians who would eventually describe its location to Allied forces. Every defensive position was documented in civilian memory, creating an intelligence database that German security measures couldn't erase or control. Jean-Baptiste Moreau's experience with his wheatfield bunkers represented one manifestation of this broader pattern. His accidental discovery while ploughing simply revealed what he'd already known was there, information he'd carried for 2 years, waiting for the opportunity to share it safely. Thousands of other French civilians had similar knowledge about other positions. Collectively, their observations created an intelligence asset that significantly accelerated Allied understanding of German defences during the Liberation campaign. The post-war historical record contains numerous accounts similar to Moreau's story. Farmers across northern France described discovering buried bunkers while resuming normal agricultural activities after liberation. Foresters found camouflaged positions in woods they'd avoided during the occupation. Urban residents pointed out bunkers disguised as ordinary buildings in cities and towns. Each discovery confirmed what French civilians had already known but couldn't safely reveal while German forces controlled their communities. The psychological impact on German soldiers who'd spent months or years maintaining what they believed were secret positions must have been profound. To discover that French civilians had known all along where bunkers were located, that the supposedly successful camouflage had never fooled people who lived on the land, that years of security measures had been futile because the enemy was all around them, observing everything, this realization must have been deeply demoralizing for German troops who'd believed they were successfully maintaining operational security. Some German documents captured after the war revealed awareness of this problem. German security services reported concerns about French civilian observations of military activities. German commanders issued orders restricting civilian access to military facilities and prohibiting discussions of defensive preparations in the presence of French residents. But these measures couldn't eliminate the fundamental problem. German forces were surrounded by hostile populations in occupied territories, and those populations couldn't be prevented from observing military activities that occurred in their communities. The extent of French civilian intelligence gathering during the occupation years only became fully apparent after liberation, when systematic interviews revealed how much information ordinary residents had accumulated. A housewife who'd sold eggs to German soldiers described how many soldiers typically bought eggs each week, information that indicated garrison sizes at nearby bunkers. A schoolteacher noted which roads German trucks used regularly, information that revealed supply routes supporting defensive positions. A priest observed which German officers attended church services, information that helped identify unit headquarters locations. None of these civilians had considered themselves intelligence operatives during the occupation. They'd simply noticed things as part of daily life. But when Allied intelligence teams asked them to describe what they'd observed, the accumulated details painted comprehensive pictures of German defensive organizations, logistics, and operations. The French resistance's formal intelligence networks had provided crucial strategic information to London throughout the occupation years, but the general civilian population's casual observations proved equally valuable once liberation made it safe to share that knowledge. This combination of deliberate intelligence gathering by organized resistance networks and inadvertent information accumulation by ordinary civilians created an intelligence environment that German forces couldn't control despite extensive security measures and harsh penalties for resistance activities. The Germans had physical control of French territory, but never achieved informational control of the French population. This distinction proved crucial during the Liberation Campaign, when the information French civilians had been accumulating for 4 years suddenly became available to Allied forces. The broader historical significance of these civilian contributions to Allied victory extends beyond their immediate tactical intelligence value. The French experience during World War II demonstrated that modern occupations create inherent vulnerabilities that occupying powers must recognize and account for in strategic planning. Occupied populations observe everything occupying forces do. Those populations remember what they observe, and when political control eventually shifts, that accumulated knowledge becomes an intelligence windfall for the previous occupier's enemies. This pattern has repeated itself in numerous conflicts since World War II. Yet military forces continue to underestimate the intelligence implications of operating in hostile civilian environments. The lesson France taught during 1940 through 1944 remains relevant. You cannot hide from people who live on the land you're trying to defend, and treating civilians as irrelevant creates intelligence liabilities that will eventually undermine defensive preparations, regardless of how sophisticated those preparations may be. Jean-Baptiste Moreau's wheat field, with its buried bunkers that his plow revealed one August morning, stands as a permanent reminder of this principle. The concrete slabs remain beneath that field today, nearly 80 years after German engineers installed them, too deeply buried and solidly constructed to remove economically. Modern aerial photographs of the area show the field divided into irregular cultivation patterns where successive generations of farmers have learned to plow around the obstacles. The bunkers have become part of the landscape, absorbed into the agricultural geography of northern France, no longer militarily relevant, but historically significant as monuments to the futility of trying to keep secrets in occupied territory. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.